What if I told you that Australia built fences stretching over 5,600 kilometers across the harshest desert on Earth? That's longer than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. That's longer than the Great Wall of China. It sounds like an impossible engineering nightmare, right? Well, Australia actually did this, and the result after a decade shocked the entire conservation world and changed everything. We thought we knew about managing ecosystems on a continental scale. This is that incredible story. But to understand why Australia would attempt such a massive undertaking, we need to go back to where this all began. Back to one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters in recorded history. A disaster that started with just 24 rabbits. Let me take you back to 1859. Picture Victorian England at the height of the British Empire. A wealthy English settler named Thomas Austin had just arrived at his sprawling estate in Victoria, Australia. Austin was a passionate hunter who missed the familiar game of his homeland. So he made what seemed like a harmless decision. He imported 24 wild European rabbits and released them onto his property for hunting. Quote, "The introduction of a few rabbits could do little harm and might provide a touch of home," he wrote in a letter to his brother back in England. Those 24 rabbits were about to become Australia's worst environmental nightmare. You see, Australia had been isolated from other continents for over 30 million years. The animals and plants that evolved there had never encountered European rabbits. There were no natural predators adapted to hunt them, no diseases to control their population, no competitors for their preferred food sources. In essence, Austin had just released 24 breeding machines into paradise. Within just 6 years, Austin's estate was overrun. Thousands upon thousands of rabbits were destroying crops, stripping vegetation bare, and multiplying at an exponential rate that shocked everyone who witnessed it. But this was just the beginning. Rabbits don't respect property boundaries. By the 1870s, rabbit populations had exploded across southeastern Australia. We're talking about millions upon millions of these animals spreading like a grey tide across the landscape. Farmers reported seeing entire hillsides that appeared to be moving, not from wind, but from the sheer mass of rabbits. The numbers were absolutely staggering. By 1890, scientists estimated that Australia was home to over 200 million rabbits, all descended from Austin's original 24 animals. In just 30 years, 24 rabbits had become 200 million. The ecological devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Rabbits were eating everything. Native grasses that had evolved over millions of years were disappearing completely. Entire plant species were being driven to extinction by the constant grazing pressure. But it wasn't just plants. Native animals that depended on these plants for food and shelter were also disappearing. Small marsupials, ground nesting birds, and countless other species were losing their habitats to the rabbit invasion. The economic impact was equally catastrophic. Farmers were losing their livelihoods as rabbits destroyed crops faster than they could be planted. Sheep stations were abandoned as rabbits ate all the grass that should have been feeding livestock. Conservative estimates suggest that by 1900, rabbits were causing over £200 million in agricultural damage annually. In today's money, that's equivalent to over $25 billion every single year. The Australian government tried everything they could think of to control the rabbit population. They organised massive shooting campaigns. Professional hunters were hired to kill rabbits by the thousands. Poison baits were scattered across vast areas of countryside. Nothing worked. For every rabbit they killed, 10 more seemed to take its place. The breeding rate was simply too fast to control through conventional means. In the 1890s, they tried introducing diseases to control the population. The myxoma virus was released across southeastern Australia with high hopes that it would provide a biological solution to the rabbit problem. Initially, the virus showed promise. Rabbit populations crashed dramatically in areas where the disease spread. Government officials were optimistic that they had finally found the solution, but evolution had other plans. Within a few years, the rabbits had developed resistance to the virus. Not only did populations recover, but they were now immune to humanity's best biological weapon against them. By 1900, the situation was desperate. Entire regions of Australia were ecological wastelands. The continent's unique flora and fauna were facing an extinction crisis. The economy was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. That's when someone proposed an idea that seemed both brilliant and insane. If you can't kill all the rabbits, maybe you can stop them from spreading further. The idea was to build a fence, not just any fence, but the longest fence in human history, a barrier that would stretch across the entire continent, separating the rabbit-infested eastern regions from the still pristine western areas. The proposal was met with immediate skepticism. Critics called it, quote, "the most expensive folly in colonial history." Engineers said it was technically impossible to build and maintain a fence across such harsh terrain. Economists argued that the cost would bankrupt the colony, but desperate times called for desperate measures. In 1901, construction began on what would officially be called the State Barrier Fence, but what everyone simply called the rabbit-proof fence. The goal was ambitious beyond imagination: build an unbroken barrier stretching over 1,800 kilometers from the southern coast to the northern interior. To put that distance in perspective, imagine building a fence from London to Rome, or from Miami to Chicago, across some of the most remote, hostile terrain on Earth. The construction project was an engineering nightmare from day one. Workers had to haul materials across hundreds of kilometers of desert using horse-drawn wagons and primitive roads. There were no nearby towns, no infrastructure, no reliable water sources. The fence itself was a marvel of 1900s engineering. It stood 6 feet high and was constructed from rabbit-proof mesh that extended 1 foot underground to prevent burrowing. Every post had to be precisely placed and secured in ground that ranged from solid rock to shifting sand. Workers faced extreme heat that regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius, dust storms that could bury sections of completed fence overnight, flash floods that could wash away weeks of work in a few hours. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Everything from fence posts to food had to be transported by camel trains or ox-drawn wagons. Workers lived in isolated camps for months at a time, dealing with loneliness, dangerous wildlife, and constant equipment failures. The project took 6 grueling years to complete. When the fence was finally finished in 1907, it had cost the equivalent of over $100 million in today's money. It employed thousands of workers and required the establishment of an entirely new government department just to manage its construction. But the completed fence was truly impressive. At 1,833 kilometers long, it was officially the longest unbroken fence ever built. It included gates for legitimate travelers, maintenance stations every few kilometers, and a dedicated workforce of fence inspectors who patrolled sections daily. The immediate results were promising. Rabbit populations west of the fence remained low, while those east of the fence continued to explode. The fence was working exactly as designed, but critics remained skeptical. They argued that the fence was too expensive to maintain, that it would inevitably fail as weather and wildlife damaged sections, that it was treating symptoms rather than addressing the root problem of invasive species management. Environmental groups raised concerns about the fence's impact on native wildlife migration. Large animals like kangaroos and emus that had traditionally moved freely across these regions were now blocked by an artificial barrier. Political opposition was fierce. Taxpayers questioned whether the enormous ongoing maintenance costs were justified. Opposition politicians called it, quote, "a monument to government incompetence and wasteful spending." The media coverage was brutal. Headlines read, "World's most expensive fence declared white elephant," and "Rabbit fence, brilliant solution or costly mistake." Even some scientists were doubtful. They questioned whether such a massive intervention in natural systems might have unintended consequences that could be worse than the original rabbit problem. For the first few years, these criticisms seemed justified. Maintenance costs were enormous. Sections of fence were constantly being damaged by storms, wildlife, or simple wear and tear. The government was spending millions of dollars annually just keeping the fence intact. But something remarkable was happening on the western side of the fence, something that would eventually silence most critics and transform the project from a controversial expense into a conservation triumph. By 1910, just 3 years after completion, scientists began documenting extraordinary ecological recovery in the protected western regions. Native plant species that had been declining for decades were making dramatic comebacks. Areas west of the fence showed dramatically higher biodiversity than comparable areas east of the fence. Native grasses were thriving. Wildflower populations were exploding during good seasons. Small mammals and birds were returning to areas where they hadn't been seen for years. The fence wasn't just keeping rabbits out. It was allowing Australia's native ecosystems to heal and recover after decades of devastation. But the really remarkable discoveries came in the 1920s, when the fence system was expanded to address other invasive species problems. The success of the original rabbit fence inspired construction of additional barriers targeting wild dogs, emus, and other problem animals. The expanded fence network eventually reached over 5,600 kilometers in total length. It included the original rabbit barrier, plus additional fences targeting dingoes and other species. Together, these barriers created protected zones covering millions of hectares of Australian landscape. The dingo fence, in particular, became a remarkable case study in ecosystem management. This barrier, stretching over 5,300 kilometers, created distinct zones where different predator-prey relationships could develop. On the northern side of the dingo fence, where wild dogs roamed freely, ecosystems developed differently than on the southern side, where dingoes were excluded. Scientists discovered that these different predator pressures created dramatically different ecological outcomes. Areas with dingoes showed more balanced prey populations and healthier vegetation. Areas without dingoes often suffered from overgrazing by kangaroos and rabbits that had lost their primary predators. By the 1930s, the fence network had become much more than a simple barrier against invasive species. It had evolved into a continental-scale experiment in ecosystem management. Different sections of Australia were developing along different ecological trajectories, based on which species could and couldn't cross the fence barriers. Scientists were essentially watching evolution and ecosystem development in real time. The agricultural benefits were enormous. Regions protected by the fence network saw dramatic increases in crop yields and livestock productivity. Areas that had been abandoned due to rabbit damage were brought back into productive use. Property values in protected zones increased substantially. Farmers who had been on the verge of bankruptcy found their land productive and valuable again. Rural communities that had been dying began to thrive. But perhaps most importantly, the fence network was proving that large-scale conservation could work. That human intervention, when properly designed and implemented, could actually help ecosystems recover from environmental damage. By the 1950s, international scientists were traveling to Australia to study the fence network and its ecological effects. The project was being hailed as one of the most successful large-scale conservation efforts in history. Countries dealing with their own invasive species problems began implementing similar barrier systems. New Zealand built fences to protect native bird populations from introduced mammals. South Africa constructed barriers to control plant invasions. Even the United States began using fence systems for ecosystem management. The success of Australia's fence network was inspiring a global revolution in conservation thinking. Instead of viewing human intervention as necessarily harmful to ecosystems, scientists were beginning to understand that carefully planned interventions could actually help nature recover from previous damage. Modern studies of the Australian fence network have revealed even more remarkable benefits than early scientists imagined. Satellite imagery shows clear ecological differences between protected and unprotected areas that are visible from space. Areas west of the original rabbit fence show dramatically higher vegetation density, greater species diversity, and more stable ecosystem dynamics than areas east of the fence. The barrier has created what scientists describe as, quote, living laboratories for ecosystem recovery. Genetic studies of native species populations show that protected areas have maintained much higher genetic diversity than unprotected regions. This genetic preservation has been crucial for species adaptation and long-term survival. Climate research has revealed that the protected ecosystems are more resilient to droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events. The diverse plant communities west of the fence provide better soil stabilization and water retention than the degraded areas to the east. Carbon sequestration studies show that protected areas are storing significantly more carbon in both vegetation and soil than unprotected regions. The fence network is inadvertently contributing to climate change mitigation on a continental scale. Economic analyses have shown that the fence network has generated billions of dollars in benefits through increased agricultural productivity, reduced environmental damage, and enhanced tourism. The return on investment has been extraordinary. Modern technology has made fence maintenance much more efficient and cost-effective. GPS monitoring, automated inspection systems, and improved materials have dramatically reduced the ongoing costs of maintaining the network. Today, the Australian fence network covers over 5,600 kilometres and protects millions of hectares of ecosystem. It's monitored by satellite, maintained by specialized crews, and studied by scientists from around the world. The fence has become more than just a barrier against invasive species. It's evolved into a continental-scale conservation infrastructure that supports biodiversity, agriculture, and scientific research. Visitors to Australia can actually see sections of the fence and learn about its history and ecological importance. Tourist routes have been developed that showcase the dramatic differences between protected and unprotected areas. The fence network has also become an important part of Australian cultural identity. It represents the country's commitment to protecting its unique natural heritage and its willingness to undertake massive projects for long-term environmental benefits. But perhaps the most important legacy of Australia's fence network is the proof it provides that large-scale conservation can succeed, that human engineering and natural processes can work together to create positive environmental outcomes. The project has inspired similar efforts around the world. Barrier systems are now being used to protect ecosystems in dozens of countries. The principles developed in Australia are being applied to conservation challenges from the Arctic to the Amazon. Recent research has identified opportunities to expand and improve the fence network further. Climate change is creating new challenges that may require additional barriers or modifications to existing ones. Scientists are also exploring how the fence network might be integrated with other conservation technologies. Satellite monitoring, genetic tracking, and artificial intelligence are being combined with traditional fence barriers to create even more effective conservation systems. The success of Australia's fence network proves that sometimes the most controversial conservation projects can become the most successful. That massive human interventions in natural systems can actually help, rather than harm, ecological recovery. From 24 rabbits that nearly destroyed a continent to over 5,600 kilometers of fence that saved it, this transformation demonstrates the power of large-scale thinking and long-term commitment to conservation goals. The Australian fence network didn't just stop invasive species. It created a model for conservation success that continues to inspire environmental protection efforts around the world. What other massive conservation challenges do you think could be solved with similarly bold approaches? What other ecosystems might benefit from large-scale barrier systems? Let me know in the comments below.